What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children. What's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. I'm pleased to have with me a special guest, Shahid Buttar, who is a candidate for Congress. He's running against Nancy Pelosi in the 12th Congressional District, but obviously Pelosi has a lot more significance beyond that district. I want to talk about, how well your campaign is doing, but first I want to ask you the question that I ask a lot of my friends who are progressive activists is, why would you even want to be in Congress? To my mind, Congress is where activists go to die. I talked about this a little bit on my show last night with regard to AOC. AOC has been moving towards the center. Now, I don't think she's compromised her values at all, but I think tactically and strategically, she's playing it a little bit different. She's picking her battles. She's realizing that if you want to get anything done in a legislative body, you have to compromise to some extent, because you want to get people to support your bills. The only way you're going to do that is if you support them and their bills. So she wasn't going to say, no, Nancy Pelosi should not be the speaker, because that really wasn't going to help her advance any of the legislation that she was going to try to do. So she's pretty smart in that respect. But at the same time, she's gone back on a very important principle, which is Democrats like yourself challenging incumbents. So she was going to set up this PAC in order to fund candidates like yourself who was going to do that. Now she's backing off of it. She's changed. Both of the people that I know who I could talk to in her campaign no longer work for her. Her chief of staff, Shoikat Chakrabarty, and her spokesperson, Corbin Trent, because they were a little bit more radical than her in terms of tactics and strategy. How do you think, being an activist yourself, you're going to navigate these waters of how you make change in a body where in order to get anything done, you have to compromise?
So thoughtful question, and I'll try to answer the different parts of it that came up. The first, you asked me, why would I want to run? And I just put it this way, it's not an aspiration, it's a frustration. I've been a constituent of Nancy Pelosi's for 20 years, and I've watched her throw a wet blanket on the attempt to bring CIA torture forward and seek executive accountability. She impeded executive accountability and impeachment long before Trump of Bush. I saw her, undermine immigrant rights while claiming credit for defending them. I saw her engineer repeated extensions of these authoritarian powers, support corporate rule, throw working class interests under the bus over and over again. And for me, it's not a grand stratagem. I'm a human being. I'm an American. I'm represented in Congress by someone who doesn't represent me or the city I live in. Nancy Pelosi, for better or worse, represents the Democratic Party, but she's ultimately accountable to the voters of San Francisco. And the reason I'm running, among other things, is to end the bipartisan consensus on corporate rule. I recognize how vulnerable she is as someone who has a lot less committed local support than people think. She has a lot of people who vote for her because she's been in office for 30 years, and hers is a name that everybody recognizes because, of course, she's in every news cycle. But when people are acquainted with and informed about her record, it can't withstand scrutiny. And when I looked at, how to take somebody like that out of office, and I looked around and tried to see who in the community might take her on, ultimately the reason I got in the race is that I have freakishly accumulated the right set of skills and experiences to do it, right? So I've run nonprofits, so I know how to manage a staff and articulate a policy vision and raise money. I've been a direct action advocate, so I am committed to the principles. This gets to your question before, how do you stay real? The way I stay real is that the people putting me in office are the people who've worked with me for the last 20 years. I am of, for, and by social movements because I am an immigrant whose family lost her house when I was 16, and it took me 10 years to get my undergrad degree while I was going to school at night. Like, my commitments to these principles are not ones that I've adopted for the sake of politics. They're baked into my experience and the experience of, frankly, millions of people who I feel very fortunate to have a chance already to represent, even while I'm seeking the opportunity to formally represent San Francisco in Washington. To your last point about some of the members of the squad, I'm very inspired by the squad substantively, and I aspire to demonstrate the same kind of influence that they demonstrated when they walked into Congress. And I'm thinking now about, when AOC conducted the sit-in the Speaker's office, or when she or Representative Ilhan Omar turned up the screws in oversight hearings, asking really pointed questions, the kind that got me arrested, to officials who aren't used to hearing those questions. Those officials need to hear those questions more often. We, the American people, need to hear those answers. And the sitting members of Congress, certainly Nancy Pelosi, are not asking those questions. And I've shown my interest in asking those questions, and I just want to hear the answers. I'd like for people to answer those questions instead of arresting me for sharing them.
Well, let me mention this to you. You talk about when you speak to Nancy Pelosi, you speak to constituents about the issues, and when they hear how she is versus how you are. To my mind, the factor of Trump affects whether that's going to work or not. And I give you the example of Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders speaks to people on the issues. When you talk to the people who voted in the primaries where he lost to Joe Biden, for example, 70% of the people in the exit polls supported Medicare for all, and yet they voted for a person who said that not only does he not support Medicare for all, he would actually veto it if it managed to pass both houses of Congress. And the only reason people are saying this could possibly be is electability. We got to have somebody who can beat Trump. But and I know that he is the least likely person to beat Trump.
Right.
And it really shows me, and I'd be curious to know if you agree with this, then the Democrats would rather re-elect Trump than elect a progressive like Bernie Sanders, who basically challenges all of their corporate donors. I mean, you look at Nancy Pelosi, you see what you mentioned, what AOC did with the Sunrise Movement.
Right.
That didn't do a damn thing. She still kept calling it the Green New Dream, derisively.
Or whatever. So the Green New Dream or whatever, I think were her words, but yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and then she talks about how Medicare for all, you could go to my basement and see I have posters for single payer from 20 years ago. But, it's not going to happen. These Democrats are giving the middle finger to the 99%. So I guess I want to ask you if you think that this fear of Trump, which is so almost irrational, because I keep trying to tell people Trump is the symptom. He's not the problem. The problem is 40 years of neoliberalism. Yes. And that's why Trump was able to get elected in the first place, because he spoke like a populist. Unfortunately, he was a populist from the right and blaming immigrants and other minorities for their people's problems. Whereas Bernie was a populist from the left who rightfully blamed billionaires and corporations. Because right now, Nancy Pelosi is perceived as the most powerful woman in our government. She's the one who is, to the resistance people, taking on Trump. Right. I mean, we know she's really not taking on Trump, or at least the corporate interest that Trump represents. But how do you get beyond that mentality by the blue no matter who, the resistance crowd, the people that don't understand what Bill Clinton did and what Barack Obama did that was equally, if not worse, for our country than the Republicans?
I won't necessarily say that what the Clinton and Obama administrations did was worse than the GOP, because I think they all, frankly, have done a great deal to abuse our republic and abuse our rights and abuse our standing in the world. When I look particularly at this fallacy, when I hear the word electability, I just feel the need to precede it with the word perceived, because Biden enjoys perceived electability for many of the same reasons that Pelosi is presumed by people to be fighting Trump. People hear the names, They attach them to narratives, even if the shoes don't fit. Biden unfortunately put millions of Americans in prison. He put Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court. He was the most conservative among 20 people running for the Democratic nomination. And the idea that he's the one who's going to end up the nominee because people are used to hearing his name is a sad reflection on our democracy. I'll say that. With Pelosi, she gets credit from people who haven't paid a lot of attention for failing the impeachment process. And it's maybe if I could just take 30 seconds here, she took a year to show up for a process that she then imposed artificial limits on, which cost the process. We could have won impeachment and removed the president if, and I'm not the only one to say it, if the impeachment process had focused on, or at least even included, the Emoluments Clause violations. There is a constitutional prohibition against self-enrichment at public expense. I wrote an article 6 months before Pelosi ever showed up for impeachment saying, we must impeach this president. Here's why, here's how. And it was shared virally by Lawrence Tribe. He's our nation's leading authority on constitutional law. And when Pelosi finally in December showed up with her hand being forced by a whistleblower, she refused to include emoluments. And I said at the time, this train will never leave the station. It is dangerous to let it proceed. I said then that impeachment on those terms, impeachment on Pelosi's terms, was worse than no impeachment at all because it ensured that the president would survive it. And what we have now is, much ado about nothing. A criminal tyrant is still in office. Corruption remains endemic across Washington, not just in the Republican Party, but in the Democratic Party too. And Biden is a perfect example of this, right? I mean, just think about the thing that they tried to pin on Trump, which, just to be clear, inviting foreign interference in a U.S. election is a crime, full stop. It should be impeachable, setting aside the fact that we do it to other countries all the time. But that notwithstanding, it's a political event, impeachment, not a legal event, which is to say we have to engineer charges that will stick. What are the charges that will resonate with GOP senators? Frankly, for GOP senators, I think there are very few, but what resonates with GOP voters who have the ears of their GOP senators? There is nothing that conservatives hate more than the idea of their tax dollars being taken. And if that was what the impeachment process was about, the ultimate welfare queen is our criminal president. And if that's what impeachment was about, you would start to hear GOP senators' phones ringing off the hook by their own constituents, and it would put in play votes that Pelosi's process did not even seek. And I frankly see the president's continued service in office as an indictment of Pelosi's leadership. And it is a reflection of her failure. And I think that she should be held accountable for it.
Yeah, no question about that. I mean, I did a show with Norman Solomon, like in the spring of 2017. He told me the day Trump took office, he put his petition up on Ruth's Action to impeach him with the Emoluments Clause, but also all the horrible things that Trump has done to the people and the planet.
Absolutely.
If those 2 weeks of hearings during our primaries had talked about all those things, then media would have had to talk about all those things because they didn't talk about all those things. They, as I said before, have abrogated their responsibility in giving citizens the information they need to function in a democracy. They just want to focus on the horse race all the time.
Well, their papers ultimately, right? It's a business to them and not an enterprise that demands commitment to a set of professional norms.
Right, which is exactly why they smeared Bernie Sanders, because he would have been an existential threat to their corporate parent companies and also to their corporate advertisers. So why don't you talk about like the 3 most important issues that you're running on and what you would do immediately upon assuming office?
The top lines for me first, I want to expand human rights to include healthcare, housing, and food. I also want to secure climate justice for future generations. I'm very deeply committed to the Green New Deal, as well as all of its visionary aspects, including the federal jobs guarantee and the just transition. And then finally, I'm very committed to anti-authoritarianism as an immigrant. And that comes out in a couple different ways. I want to end mass incarceration. I want to end mass surveillance. And I want to abolish ICE to respect immigrant rights. Those are, so you see a socialist aspiration in expanding human rights. You see basically a libertarian aspiration in defending rights in crisis. And when we think about climate justice, I think of that as an intersectional commitment to everyone's grandchildren that I frankly would wish that the rest of the political system, one would hope, might share. I think it's appalling, frankly, that that has to be an object of controversy, and that it isn't something we can all agree on. In terms of these issues, these are all issues where Nancy Pelosi, unfortunately, has stood well to the right of San Francisco. And I feel very strongly that the nation's most progressive city deserves a voice in Washington that will stand for our city's visionary values. I'd locate this in a particular moment in time, contrasting our histories. Before running for Congress, Nancy Pelosi was basically a Democratic Party fundraiser. And I've been an issue advocate for the last 20 years. I would enter Congress with vastly more policy experience and preparation than she did when she entered Congress. You mentioned before the press abdicating its role. She hasn't debated a challenger in 30 years. And I'm the first Democrat that she's ever going to have had to face in a November election. And it does seem to me that if the press does its job, constituents will have an opportunity to hear us debate. I would say this, and I'll defend this. I would love to have an opportunity to prove this in public. Her record cannot withstand critique by an informed interlocutor. And she gets a free pass by a lot of reporters. She gets a free pass by a lot of institutional partisan Democrats. Her record cannot survive critique by someone willing to stand with San Francisco values. And here's how willing I am to stand with San Francisco values. In 2003, when Pelosi was in Congress, ineffectively doing what she did to try to stop Bush's war in Iraq, which she later then went on to fund and insulate as Speaker of the House, I was organizing street demonstrations trying to stop it. As a young lawyer, a year later, working in Washington for a San Francisco law firm, I represented the second mayor in the country to solemnize and recognize the right of consenting adults to marry a partner of their choice. I stood for gay rights in the courts as a cis, hetero, Muslim lawyer raised in the Midwest in 2004. This is long before most Democrats stood up for equality. It was nearly a decade before Nancy Pelosi, with all of the institutional power and privilege of the Speaker of the House under the Bush administration, she refused to support equal rights for my gay neighbors. And I was fighting for it in the courts. And that contrast between a young lawyer stepping outside my own community to defend the rights of others when they were in crisis, and a powerful gatekeeper stepping on the communities that are clamoring for equal recognition, there could be no sharper distinction. And all I've ever done is defend the rights of my neighbors and defend our democracy. It's why I went to law school. It's the mission that I feel inspired by. I have since my earliest days. The inscription on the base of the Statue of Liberty, it means something to me. I am one of the huddled, tired masses that yearn to be free. And I don't want to let freedom and liberty slip through our fingers in a time that we can defend them. And I see too many Americans not recognize how these principles are at stake. I certainly see Nancy Pelosi either not recognize or simply prove unwilling to defend these principles. You said it before, I think ultimately she is accountable to the corporate interests that put her in office. And I think that's true of most of the Democratic Party. It's one reason why I'm so inspired by the squad, because I see a different voice emerging, of voices that are diverse, voices that are post-colonial, voices that have our own experiences rooted in the same life experiences that so many other Americans have gone through. And, having lost a home, having gone to night school for 10 years to get my degree to then have an opportunity to pursue my education, I've seen in my own life many of the challenges that Americans today are grappling with. People who are housing insecure, people who are unhoused. I can relate to them. I understand how arbitrary that experience can be. And it's not like people who are unhoused chose to be there or necessarily did anything wrong. A lot of them are just sick. People who feel ill, who can't pay their medical bills, and now they live in the street because we're so barbaric and heartless that we don't recognize housing as a human right.
Okay, well, I don't mean to cut you off here, but clearly you have the entire progressive platform. You don't have to convince my audience that you're the better candidate than Nancy Pelosi, okay? You have to know who your audience is right now. Everybody that's watching my show wants you to win. But my question to you is, campaigning, not even during a coronavirus, is difficult for progressive candidates, especially when you admit that Nancy Pelosi is known for her fundraising. She is going to do whatever it takes to retain this seat. She's decided that she wants only one more term, and she wants to resign when she wants to resign and not a day before that. So if Jovanka Beckles, who was a candidate that I supported, who DSA supported, who Our Revolution supported, who so many, the Richmond Progressive Alliance supported, so many activist groups were out there with people power knocking on doors for her, which we know is the only way that you can counteract the mainstream media. It's why Bernie won California. He had 100 staffers here, and they were doing a robust field program. One of his biggest mistakes is that he didn't have that program beyond California. He didn't have a field program in Texas or any of the other Super Tuesday states. He was thinking that he would just win the first 5 and that would cement him as the front runner. He had no plan for the consolidation that Obama engineered, by the way. And this is why I am so bitter at Bernie Sanders, because what does he do? He confers with the very man that sabotaged his campaign last week before suspending his campaign. He doesn't confer with us. You know, the campaign's supposed to be not me, us. He confers with Obama, who it's like Jesus conferring with Judas, right? And he drops out, and then today he gets on with Joe Biden and endorses him. And I'm watching this thing, and Bernie's trying to ask him questions, and Joe Biden's reading from a teleprompter. The entire time he was reading from a teleprompter. His people don't even trust him to have an impromptu conversation because he's so senile. And now he's sitting there saying, Joe understands, using the same language that he used with Hillary. Hillary understands. Joe doesn't understand any of that stuff. He only understands what his corporate paymasters tell him.
I can't endorse Joe Biden given his record, you know, putting Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, the crime bill, Joe Biden, you know, the bankruptcy bill, keeping students from seeking bankruptcy relief for their student loan debt. You know, Joe Biden is not somebody I can support. But I also can't, frankly, blame Bernie for making his choices. I understand I would rather he make different ones, but Bernie's done so much to empower a vast spectrum of possibilities, political possibilities. He's inspired so many millions of people to get involved for the first time. He inspired me to run for this seat. And I can't critique Bernie. You know, I mean, I recognize some of the pressures he's under. I can't imagine all of them. I wish that he might have made other choices, you know, in terms of staying in the race and not endorsing Biden, but I'm not going to fault him for it.
Okay, we have this once in a century opportunity with the pandemic and the Great Depression that's going to be coming from it, with 25, 30% of people unemployed. I was thinking that he should have voted against that corporate bailout. He should have quit the Senate, and he should have led a campaign, used his organization to lead a campaign for a rent strike, a student debt strike, and then a general strike, because that is really meeting this moment, not with some of these small bore things that he's working on, like extending unemployment benefits to gig workers, you know?
I'm with you on the general strike, but I also don't want to, that extension of the unemployment insurance benefit program, that frankly was huge. And I think people don't frankly recognize how big a deal that was. I mean, Bernie is the reason that not just gig workers, but also students and people in between jobs have opportunities to secure unemployment assistance. And one of the things that really means, there have been empirical studies mapping that states that have more robust unemployment insurance, they have stronger organized labor that is more effectively able to, for instance, withhold labor. And the capacity of organized labor to strike, to seek our demands, to seek better working conditions, to seek fair wages, to seek retirement benefits. This is a crucial lever for the labor movement. And what Bernie did was a lot bigger than simply ensure benefits for a class of people that had never received them before. What he did structurally enhanced and created a powerful potential lever for the labor movement. And I think that's exactly the kind of visionary strategy that he brings to the table. You know, I think that was a much bigger victory than the political culture has internalized.
How do you run a campaign under normal circumstances when you're going against big money like this? And how do you do it during a coronavirus when you can't knock doors?
Yeah, that is an important question. It's the question that we are unraveling over the next 6 months. So just to set the stage there, in 2018, I led the progressives in San Francisco with 17,000 votes. This spring, a month ago, we got 33,000. So we've effectively close to doubled our total from before. We have to do that twice in the next 6 months. And we're situated to do it. We developed a field plan. mapped out which doors to be knocking on. To this point, we've really only focused on the progressive community in San Francisco. That's who we needed to consolidate to get through the jungle primary. But now there's basically a whole wing of the city, much of the city, that we haven't even attempted to reach out to before because we were focused on consolidating the progressive vote. And so now we're turning our sights on it. One of the things we're doing right now is testing distributed phone banking infrastructure. And all of us who've made calls for Bernie, between the last 2 cycles, I put in dozens of hours for him. And, when we were putting in those calls, we often had weeks to flip entire states. We have 6 months to flip a single city, which is to say we have all the time in the world. Effectively, we have thousands of volunteers. It's an open invitation to any of your listeners. If you want to see Nancy Pelosi replaced by an immigrant democratic socialist, visit us online. We're at shahidforchange.us. Anybody can volunteer. We're eager to put people on the phones. And especially in the context of the pandemic, during the shelter in place order, we can't knock on doors. So really all we can do is call people. This is really for all respect to, I'll use a different image. I was going to say meat and potatoes, which is, and I wanted to be more respectful to vegetarians. This is the core of a campaign, is voter outreach and contact. And, like any campaign, we are reliant on volunteer support to extend our reach, and we will be vastly outgunned by Pelosi. We've raised more support for our campaign than any campaign to challenge her in the past. So I'm confident we'll have the resources to deploy a citywide campaign. And still, like any campaign, our ultimate reach is going to be determined by volunteers. So I want to particularly thank each of the 16,000 donors around the country that are fueling our campaign. I want to thank each of the 2,000 volunteers. I want to thank everybody on our staff and who's worked with the campaign and the vendors. We're just getting started. We have 6 months to climb a very steep hill. And, there's a remarkable prize at the top, because when we end the speaker's career, the day, a year earlier or 2 years earlier than she would have wanted, the message it will send to Washington is that you might be able to ignore particular presidential campaigns. You might be able to suppress particular presidential campaigns. You might be able to engineer corrupt consolidations of careerist candidates to effectively contrive elections, but you cannot suppress a set of ideas whose time has come. And our movement is long overdue to have more voices in Congress. This city is long overdue to have a real progressive champion for our shared values in Washington, and particularly under this president. Whether it's Biden or Trump, I am very committed to fighting the agenda of the next president to defend human rights in crisis. And we're going to need people in Washington who understand what real resistance means. And having resisted Bush's wars and Obama's deportations and drone strikes and Trump's corruption and Pelosi's complicity in all of it, I am eager to do that job in Washington on behalf of we the people of the United States and the people of San Francisco.
I'm going to give you an idea that I gave the Bernie campaign, and I know you started to do some of it, which is, I think, my killer app for your winning your campaign. And
Okay.
that is setting up a mutual aid. And when I say mutual aid, I don't mean just providing them with stuff. I mean organizing them to be actors and have agency in their own community in the same way that Occupy Sandy did. What you can do is you can get your volunteers to go 50 doors from where they live, whether it's 50 houses or 50 apartments, and put flyers under those doors, basically saying you're going to set up a call. You can use, I don't know, freeconferencecall.com or Maestro Call. We used to use those during Occupy. And you basically use those calls to figure out what people need and who wants to provide what they need. And you don't even mention your campaign except to say that you're the ones that are organizing. So when they realize who has helped them during this time, they will have a psychological association with your campaign. And also, you can serve a greater civic purpose by letting them know what aid is available to them, whether it's housing aid or healthcare aid or food aid. But you also get people to say, okay, so-and-so is immunocompromised, cannot go to the grocery. Who wants to do a grocery shopping for that person? Or maybe we'll get 5 people together that need stuff on the block, so we don't have 5 different people going to the grocery store, which is such a hazardous place to be these days. Who would have thought? And then you can say, Well, who needs a call? Who's a senior shut-in who just doesn't speak to somebody from 1 minute, one day to the next? Maybe we can call that person phone. What do you think of that idea?
We've done a lot of it. We haven't done the bringing communities together, but we've made over 1,000 phone calls to San Franciscans to do much of what you're describing, particularly to share not like grocery delivery, but sharing information about, for instance, the pop-up food pantries that the San Francisco Marin Food Bank has put together, or the free food pickup programs that the San Francisco Unified School District has made available. We've offered publicly available information on how to take advantage of various city and nonprofit programs. We're basically not set up to do service delivery, but we are set up to do information delivery. So that's much of what we've done since the primary on March 3rd. In fact, the San Francisco Chronicle ran a story on us about 2 weeks, talking about the mutual aid pivot that our campaign made in the face of the coronavirus. So we're really just relaunching voter outreach now. I mean, we haven't been doing voter outreach since the primary. So that's just relaunching. And one of the reasons we're relaunching it is, frankly, we're not sure how long the shelter in place order is going to last. You know, it seemed to be the case in early March that perhaps, you know, it wouldn't go on that long and we could get back on the doors knocking where we need to be. It's clear that this is going to go on for a while. And so we're pivoting, not just for the near term, but for the intermediate term, to make sure we can reach people over the phone instead of at their door in a way that doesn't put anybody at risk. I've delivered groceries to seniors and I've volunteered with a food bank and got some particulate masks to a nonprofit. Our volunteers, the ways that we've engaged them as change agents, to some extent, I wouldn't say the virus has been how we've done it maximally. The point where we've sort of best embodied that recommendation, which I absolutely agree with, you're absolutely right, was probably after there was an off-duty FBI agent who shot one of my unhoused neighbors about 150 feet from my front door about a month ago. And there were 3 community meetings responding to it. The first one, I went to it, was convened by a local homeless youth services organization, and people were grieving. The second one was convened by local authorities, including members of our board of supervisors and a representative from District Attorney Chesa Boudin's office. And all of them said, this is outrageous, and there's nothing any of us can do about it. The third meeting our campaign organized, it was the first, and to my knowledge, only meeting at which the survivor's family was heard publicly. And they FaceTimed the survivor of the shooting in from his hospital bed into the meeting. And when everybody left that meeting, they were signed up to work in cop watch shifts. So around police accountability issues, we've been especially engaged in helping our volunteers do more than supporting our campaign, like engaging in the issues. Right. When we participated in the occupation of the ICE headquarters each of the last 2 years, that was similarly, you know, engaging people as more than just campaign supporters, but as independent change agents. And I absolutely agree. I think that is the ultimate opportunity for any campaign. You know, I see our voters not just as people who can transactionally check a box for us on a given day, but you know, I'm very invested in the notion of popular sovereignty. And I see each of our donors, volunteers, voters, each of those people are the folks who are going to make sure that the agenda I'm running on, whether I'm the person in the 12th Congressional District seat in the next session of Congress or not, those are the people who are going to ensure that the ideas survive the campaign.
I want to promote my shows for the rest of the week. Tomorrow I'm going to have Chris Smalls, who was the Amazon warehouse worker from their JFK warehouse, who was fired for talking about the crowded, unsanitary conditions in that warehouse, and his colleague. Wednesday, I'm going to be having on Jim Lardner, who writes for the American Prospect, who did an exhaustive investigative project called Mapping Trump's Corruption, about all the corruption in every agency of the White House and every office of the administration. And then on Thursday, I'm going to have Branko Marcetic, who just wrote a book published by Jacobin Press called Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden. Just tell everybody your website if they want to donate to you, if they want to volunteer for you.
Thank you, Lauren. Visit us online at shahidforchange.us. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube at Shahid for Change.
Great. Thank you very much. So everybody stay safe, stay home, and keep fighting.